Hello and welcome to my presentation today on understanding persistent disruptive behaviour at school as an emotional barrier to learning. So I'm Erin Dysart. I work at the University of York in the Department of Education, more specifically the Psychology in Education Research Centre. I'm both an associate lecturer there and also a researcher as well. I do a lot of research in evaluations. So making sure, obviously, that all these wonderful things that we implement into school are impacting on children the way that we expect them to. And it's been really over the last couple of years that I've become extremely interested in why children behave the way that they do, mainly because I have my own children as well, and we like to understand these things as parents. But yeah, what's the best way to kind of react to that? And this presentation is certainly kind of not a lecture saying this is what we should be doing, because I do acknowledge that obviously for teachers, when we're in the situation in the classroom and children are being disruptive, it's very hard not to be reactive to that. So as I say, certainly not a lecture on telling you how to be teachers, because you know how to do that already. I would just like to give thanks to the North Yorkshire Coast Research School for allowing me to do this conference presentation, and also thanks to my colleague Dr. Poppy Nash for allowing me to use some of her slides within this presentation as well. Dr. Poppy Nash does a lot of research in this area and is also very passionate about disruptive behaviour and the reasons for that disruptive behaviour. So what are we going to cover today then? So we're going to be looking at why it matters how teachers perceive disruptive behaviour in school. We're also going to look at the relevance of the attachment perspective when working with troubled pupils, particularly those at risk of exclusion. I would like to point out here that there are lots and lots of different theories and reasons around why children obviously are troubled and may present disruptive behaviour. But as I say, today we're just going to be looking at attachment theory, but I would advise you to think a bit more broadly about some of the things that we're talking about. And then lastly, I'll just cover some research findings and obviously look at the implications for schools. So why does it matter then how teachers perceive disruptive behaviour at school? And there's been quite a lot of literature around this subject. And a literature review was done by Wilson in 2002, and it identified the greatest stressor to be pupils' failure to work or behave. And as I say, you as teachers know exactly how that feels, how that is in a classroom when all you want to do is get the children to get on with their work and stop chatting and stop flicking pens and being silly. And there's a lot of recent literature which supports this finding as well. Kyriakou in 2011 is one of those. So if disruptive behaviour puts stress on the teachers, then this kind of perspective about why the behaviour is occurring in the first place really needs to change, and I'll come on to a bit more about that in a moment. But we also need to think as well that if the teachers are stressed, then how do we think that this is going to make the students feel? So we might ask the question as teachers, as educators, why aren't my students behaving? And there's a lot that is written about the merits of embedding, as we know, an effective behaviour policy in both primary and secondary schools. Taylor in 2012 is just one of those examples. And Taylor kind of has a checklist for school, which includes things like having golden rules displayed, parallel praise, so making sure that we're praising good behaviour rather than highlighting the negative behaviour, and having things like a reward system in place which is used consistently. However, this kind of thinking emanates from very much a behavioural perspective. And it's really talking about the child or children really deliberately engaging in this disruptive behaviour. So this behavioural perspective would say that the child has a choice and they're making that choice to be disruptive. And really, that's a very simplistic way of thinking. So what if students are not choosing to be disruptive? What if they're not actually in control of this behaviour? And this now is, there's a real growing literature which is indicating that disruptive behaviour in the most troubled pupils is often associated with trauma. So it can be a fear response that's actually triggered by some form of attachment difficulty. So Geddes and Bommer have some fantastic books on this. And they say where a deep-seated emotional response is triggered, the student may not be able to control their behaviour and therefore they're not choosing to act in that way. So what's the relevance then of attachment theory in all of this? So there's a real onus on the significance of early relationships. I'm sure all of you are aware of Bowlby's theory of attachment. And Bowlby says that children need to feel safe and have their needs met to form secure attachments. And what this can then do is actually protect their mental health. And poor attachment can occur when in these very early relationships, that security that the child needs is maybe inconsistent. So the caregiver might be very negative, they might be neglectful or abusive. And where these things happen to children when they're very young, this is a real risk factor for their poor mental health. The mental health schools talk a lot about this, and they say that what we actually see in these children is that they might find it difficult to ask for help, to manage their own thoughts, emotions and behaviour. They may find it difficult to form positive relationships with both staff and peers. They can find it difficult to concentrate and take part in learning, struggle to calm themselves down, be demanding and rejecting at the same time, become quickly or disproportionately angry or upset at times where there's no real clear triggers for it. They might be very scared of being vulnerable, but might mask this by being highly controlling of others and through these very unpredictable and explosive outbursts. They might also avoid getting close to others and appear withdrawn or disengaged from school activities. They may struggle to ask for help or show little emotional response or be confused and kind of give confusing responses. So when we sometimes hear a child laugh when they've hurt others or they've been told off about something. So as I say, the mental health schools, they talk a lot about this. So I put a link on there for you. So please do have a look at that if you want to look further into it. So as I say, there's a real growing interest now in the application and the implications of attachment theory to education. And it's been promoted through the publications of lots of different books written by educational psychotherapists. So people like Geddes in 2006 wrote a book called Attachment in the Classroom. Bommer in 2007 wrote a book called Inside I'm Hurting. And Sunderland et al. In 2009 wrote Teenagers and Attachment. So some really good books to go and have a look at there if you're interested in understanding more about this and more about the ways that school can affect children who have attachment difficulties. and how as a school and as individuals we can actually support that. So just looking then a bit more about attachment. So we know then when children have a healthy, secure attachment, they feel safe and calm and protected and nurtured by their caregivers. So their experience of the world is very safe and it's an exciting place to explore. They see others as very loving and caring and trustworthy. And they can also see their self as lovable and competent and able to make an impact on the world. So they have a really strong internal working model for all these different things. However, when early relationships are damaged, children may develop emotional, behavioural and learning difficulties. And this damaged attachment can result from various different things, including neglect, physical or sexual or emotional abuse, drug or alcohol abuse, family breakdowns, lots and lots of things that happen in those early years in children's lives. And the world is not perfect. So, you know, we've all been through certain things that in our lives that will, when we've been young, that might impact on attachment. And I think we do have to see attachment as not being all of one or just the other. I think we'll all go through periods in our life when things that have happened to us when we're younger will affect us as adults as well. So what's the point then in knowing about these attachment difficulties? So we need to know about them because they inhibit learning. So at birth, when a child is born, it has around 100 billion brain cells, which aren't connected to form networks yet. And eventually when those networks do form, they will enable thinking and learning to take place. And it's now very well established in the literature that a traumatized child brain wires up differently. And the impact that has is then that it can make learning a lot more difficult. So we need to know about attachment to understand that actually when a child has been traumatized when they're younger, and like we say, that could be anything through parent separation or some kind of child abuse, then we have to think, is it their fault that they're behaving in the way that they're behaving if their brains are now wired up differently to what we would expect? So by the age of 3, children will have formed approximately 1 trillion of these neural brain connections. And this is approximately twice as many as the adult brain. And the quantity and the quality of these stimulating interactions between caregiver and the child in the first 3 years of life play the largest roles in determining a child's emotional development, as well as their learning potential and the level of adult functioning. Not least in managing stress and anxiety. Connections which are repeated most consistently in childhood are the ones that are most likely to become permanent. And conversely, a lack of experience may create deficits in neural connections. So, for example, a child who's rarely spoken to may have insufficient neurons for mastering language. So we start to see the impact of this very early on in the early years in a child's development. And then what happens at around 11 years old is the brain starts going through this self-pruning kind of process. And this pruning process is getting rid of all the excess neural connections. And it retains the strongest ones, so those that are used most often. So If throughout the child's life up to that point, they haven't been using those neural connections which allow them to inhibit responses or to have sufficient language, then they're precisely the neural connections which will be going away during this pruning process. And really importantly, this is precisely the age and the stage children move to secondary school. So that transition at secondary school is so very important in supporting children through this pruning process and ensuring that the child is given all the opportunities that they need. So Bevington in 2008 notes that many hundreds of children are affected by attachment issues and may present symptoms at school. So we see that there's a real dramatic change as children come from the security of a relatively small and nurturing primary school to a much larger and unfamiliar school when they get to secondary. And this larger school has increased number of pupils, it's combined with many more teachers and subjects to learn, and this can really trigger profound difficulties associated with insecure attachments. For example, we might see panic, fear, anxiety and helplessness. Actually, I'll change that. We might not see those things, but that's what's actually happening to the child. What we might actually see is very much disruptive behaviour. And generally speaking, when a child first joins in year 7, they kind of struggle through. But by year 8 and year 9, the strain often gets too much and we see things like truanting and behaviour problems becoming all too evident. We also see more temptations of drink, of drugs, of crime in adolescence. And all this can lead to permanent exclusion from school. And it's very well documented now that children who are permanently excluded from school generally would turn to crime and a range of other risky behaviours. And what sometimes teachers don't know is that actually school can be a potential trigger for attachment difficulties. And like I say, it's unbeknown to teachers. So it might be something like the tone of a teacher's voice or their appearance or clothes, maybe their mannerisms. They might have the potential to trigger early associations of the home environment. So as I said, this panic and fear and anxiety and sense of helplessness. And actually the behaviour that we see is a fear or trauma response in the child, not necessarily a child choosing to be disruptive or challenging. Okay, so how then do children with attachment difficulties present at school? So there's 3 patterns of insecure attachment behaviour identified by Ainsworth in 1978. And we'll go through these in turn. So there's the avoidance style, resistance style, a disorganised style. And it's actually possible for children to display a combination of all these behaviour styles. So first, just let's look at a secure attachment style. So Bomber in 2007 says that the child will be feeling that adults are reliable and helpful. I know that I can trust them to look out for me, to meet my needs. I am okay if you are with me or busy doing other things, and you find me relatively easy to relate to. And some of the key characteristics that we might see, having learned through early experience with caregivers that they're okay, adults are okay, and the world is okay in general. They're able to take risks required by learning, and will usually reach academic potential. Approximately 55 to 65% of the population present with a secure attachment style. But this then means that 35 to 45% of the population don't. So when we've got secure attachment, we will see the relationship, a good relationship between both the teacher, the pupil, and the task at hand as well. And all those will be interacting with each other all very nicely. What about the avoidance style? So here Bomber says that the children are believing that adults are rejecting or intrusive. So when I meet you, I will avoid and ignore you and look after myself. I won't be asking for help, and no matter what I face. Why would I trust you? You have no idea what I need. And some of the key characteristics that we might see is the child actively trying to meet their needs on their own. Might be due to a depressed or abusive caregiver. They may present as very self-sufficient and may be difficult to connect with emotionally. And these, therefore, are the children that can be even kind of overlooked or forgotten about in class. So if we look at Geddes' triangle, so we see that the pupil is focused on the task, the teacher is focused on the task, but actually there's no interaction between the pupil and the teacher. So what about the resistance style? So here the child might believe that adults are unpredictable. I have to draw attention to myself to get you to notice me and to make sure I get my needs met. I can't rely on you working out what I need and when. I can't bear being ignored. That terrifies me. And again, some of the key characteristics we might see would be children attempting to get the adult's attention by whatever means. So lots of attention-seeking behaviour. And behind constant chattering and interruption, there may actually lie an anxiety that the child isn't going to get noticed. So what we see is this disruptive behaviour in class. And these children are generally so preoccupied with the relationship that they actually have little energy left for learning. So you can see here that the focus is on the relationship with the teacher, and it excludes the tasks. And the disorganised attachment style. Adults are either frightening or frightened most of the time. I don't know whether to approach you or to run away from you. I'm bad. Why should I trust you? But then I need to sometimes. I need to stay in control. Who knows what will happen next? So these disorganised children are often the hardest to relate to at school because their behaviour is often erratic and unpredictable. And these may be the children that are most at risk for school exclusion. They expect the worst because they can't imagine anyone wishing to take a genuine interest in them, least of all the teachers. Children try to control everything because they can't risk being vulnerable in any way, and this triggers this very much as a sense of helplessness. And children are often so preoccupied with needing to survive that they find it really hard to settle into a lesson or to relax into any relationships. So here what we're seeing is the behaviour is representing a failure to integrate feelings and thoughts with profound implications for learning, because there is no relationship with the teacher and there is no connection with the task. So what's really important then is that school can be the first experience of a secure attachment. So it's about having predictability and routine, consistent carers, a curriculum content, calming tasks, firm and consistent boundaries. And it's also a place where it's safe to discuss things. They're enabled to seek support from school staff. And they can develop a consistent plan with the school staff. And what we see here is actually, if we understand what's going on with the child, we see a change in school staff from, rather than it being a reaction to behaviour, we can actually reflect on that behaviour to try and understand what the child needs. So where does negative self-talk come from? So if a child in early years is repeatedly told by adults that they're hopeless, useless, undeserving, the child internalises these messages and believes that they're true. And this shapes the child's self-perception and self-esteem. And it can also have seriously damaging impact on the child's school education, perhaps most evidently at secondary school, like we say, when those big changes are happening, not just in school, but also within the child's brain as well. So Dr. Poppy Nash and colleagues wanted to look into this and develop some research questions. So they asked, to what extent do primary and secondary school teachers think that people can control their disruptive behaviour at school? And actually what they found was that the majority of teachers thought that pupils could control their own behaviour. Also, to what extent are teachers aware that a pupil's disruptive behaviour is a means of communicating emotional distress? And again, what they found was actually it was only a very small proportion of teachers who realised that. I think now we're becoming much more aware of attachment and the impacts of life in general at the minute on children, that we are becoming a lot more aware of these things. But what are the implications? So the study advocates a framework for managing disruptive behaviour in school. So whereby behaviour management strategies are used in conjunction with much more collaborative problem-solving approach. And this approach sees disruptive behaviour as expressing an emotional need, which requires a reflective and compassionate proactive response from school staff, rather than a reactive and punitive one. So Dr. Ross Green has done a lot of research in this area, looking at collaborative and proactive solutions. And what he talks about is there needs to be a focus on the problems and solving those problems, and not on the behaviours and trying to modify those behaviours. Because if the problem remains, then the behaviour will remain. And Dr. Ross Green says that all kids can do well if they can. And a kid would do well if he could. So the question needs to be, what is getting in the way and stopping the child from doing as well as they could? So he suggests that challenging kids lack some skills. So he says that challenging kids are challenging because they lack the skills not to be challenging. They are delayed in the development of crucial cognitive skills. And these crucial cognitive thinking skills include flexibility and adaptation, frustration tolerance, and problem solving. So when we see these very challenging situations at school, when children are getting into fights with each other or arguing with each other, he suggests that these challenging situations are occurring when the cognitive demands being placed upon a person outstrip the person's capacity to respond adaptively. So in other words, the child might be getting into a fight not because they actually want to fight with another child, but it might be that they're not able to inhibit a response to the child. So he suggests that we should have new roles for adults working with behaviourally challenging kids. And he suggests that we need to identify lagging skills and work on developing those skills. We need to identify unsolved problems and solve problems collaboratively and proactively. So again, not reactively, just reacting to the behaviour, but understanding what the problem is in the first place and how you can help the child to develop the skills that they're missing. So how are lagging skills and unsolved problems identified? So Dr. Ross Green has developed the assessment of lagging skills and unsolved problems. So I've given you a link there. I'm not going to go through it with you today, and I'm not going to go into any more detail about it, but I really would advise that you look at some of these websites that I've given here, and it will give you a lot more information on Dr. Ross Green's work about how to implement a strategy to support these children. So, in conclusion then, Delaney in 2012 captures the essence of the current challenges for those concerned with the welfare of troubled pupils in suggesting that it might be the lack of shared knowledge about each other's professions that can lead to unhelpful assumptions. Increasing recognition that schools have a vital role to play in a second chance learning. And much more work, as we know, needs to be done very urgently to establish a shared knowledge base founded on very much mutual respect and understanding of what disruptive behaviour in most troubled pupils is actually telling us. And I think very, very importantly, we should all, when we seek some kind of disruptive behaviour, we all have to understand that all learning has an emotional base. So in order to get the children to learn to their best potential and their full potential, we have to address the emotional issues that are underlying them. So I've given you some further references and further reading on the next few slides. Thank you very much for listening. If you do want to ask any questions, please do drop me an email. My email is on the very first slide of the PowerPoint presentation. And thank you again to North Yorkshire Coast Research School for allowing me to present this. Thank you.